The forest is silent in a way that shouldn't be possible. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of wind through dead branches and the crunch of boots on frozen ground. The kind of silence that makes you stop walking and listen for something you can't quite name. October 25th, 1974. Medicine Bow National Forest, Wyoming. A man walks alone between the trees, rifle in hand, breath visible in the cold air. His name is Carl Higdon. He's hunting elk. He doesn't know it yet, but something is hunting him. Within the hour, Carl Higdon will fire a bullet that refuses to obey the laws of physics. He'll meet a being that calls itself Ausso One. He'll be taken somewhere that exists outside the geometry of our world, transported to a place where time bends and gravity becomes meaningless. And then, for reasons he'll never fully understand, for reasons that will haunt investigators for decades, they'll let him go, not because they were merciful, not because they were finished with him, but because, after examining every aspect of his body and mind, they decided he wasn't good enough. He failed a test he didn't know he was taking. This is the story of a man who was chosen, then rejected, and the question that haunts every investigator who's studied his case, every person who's heard his testimony and looked into his eyes. Why did they release Carl Higdon? What were they looking for? And what happens to the ones who pass? Carl Higdon was unremarkable in every sense of the word. 41 years old, oil driller, married, father of 2. He lived in Rawlins, Wyoming, a town of 8,000 people where nothing much happened and people preferred it that way. Carl wasn't the kind of man who made things up. His friends would tell you that. His coworkers would tell you that. He didn't drink heavily. He didn't use drugs. He went to work, came home, watched television with his family, went to bed. Normal, predictable, reliable. He'd grown up in Wyoming, knew the land the way some people know the rooms of their childhood home. He'd been hunting since he was 12 years old, could track elk through snow and stone, could read the forest the way other men read newspapers. There was nothing in those woods that should have frightened him, but in the weeks leading up to October 25th, there were small fractures in that normalcy. Things Carl never mentioned to investigators until much later, when pressed. When they asked him to remember everything, even the parts that didn't seem to matter. Dreams that lingered too long after waking. Not nightmares exactly, just strange. He'd find himself in vast open spaces, looking up at skies that were the wrong color. He'd wake with the taste of metal in his mouth, his sheets soaked with sweat, his heart racing for no reason he could name. Moments where time felt elastic, stretched thin. A Tuesday afternoon where he couldn't account for 40 minutes. He'd been driving home from work, taking the same route he took every day, and suddenly he was pulling into his driveway with no memory of the journey between. The radio was on a different station. His coffee was cold. The sun had moved across the sky. He brushed it off. People do that. We rationalize the impossible because the alternative is too uncomfortable. He told himself he'd been tired, daydreaming, working too many hours on the rig. His wife noticed he'd become distant. Not sad exactly, not angry, just somewhere else. When she asked if something was wrong, he'd smile and say he was tired, that work was wearing him down, that he needed to get out into the mountains for a few days, clear his head. But his eyes had changed. She noticed that, though she didn't say anything, they were watching for something, listening, like a man who knows someone's following him but can't see who it is. Their daughter, 8 years old, asked him one morning why he kept looking out the window at night. Carl didn't have an answer. He didn't remember doing it. Carl went hunting that Friday morning because he needed to feel solid again. Needed the weight of the rifle in his hands, the cold air in his lungs, the simple, ancient task of tracking game through the wilderness. He needed to be alone with something real, something that made sense according to the old rules. The rules he understood. He told his wife he'd be back by evening, kissed his children goodbye, loaded his truck with his rifle, ammunition, a thermos of coffee, and a sense of relief that he was finally escaping whatever had been pressing down on him for weeks. He drove into the Medicine Bow National Forest just after dawn, took a logging road up into the high country, and parked near a clearing he'd hunted before. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache when you breathe deep. He checked his rifle, loaded a round into the chamber, and started walking. The unshakable feeling that something was waiting for him in those trees came later, about an hour into his walk, a certainty that settled into his bones like the cold. He was right. The Medicine Bow Range sprawls across southern Wyoming like the exposed spine of something ancient and dead. Mountains that rise into thin air, forests of pine and aspen that go on for miles without a road or building to break them up. In late October, the aspens are bare, skeletal against the sky. The ground is hard with frost, crunching underfoot. Snow clings to the shadows where the sun doesn't reach. It's a landscape of stone and silence, beautiful in the way that desolate things are beautiful. Beautiful and indifferent, the kind of place where you can walk for hours without seeing another human being, where you can scream and no one will hear you. Carl parked his truck near a logging road and walked into the forest just after dawn. The air was sharp, cold enough to sting his lungs with every breath. He moved slowly through the trees, scanning for elk sign, his boots crunching through patches of crusted snow. The rifle was familiar in his hands, a .7mm Magnum he'd owned for years. A good gun, reliable. The morning passed slowly. He saw tracks, deer, elk, something that might have been a mountain lion, but no animals themselves. The forest felt empty. He kept walking deeper into the high country, following game trails that wound between the pines. By mid-afternoon, he still hadn't seen anything. The sun was starting its descent, casting long shadows through the trees. Carl was thinking about heading back to the truck when the wrongness finally registered. The forest felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. No birdsong, no squirrels chittering in the branches, no distant crack of branches as deer moved through the underbrush. Just the wind and the sound of his own breathing and the crunch of his boots on frozen ground. Carl stopped walking, stood perfectly still, listened. Nothing. The silence pressed against his eardrums like water pressure. Unnatural. Wrong. Then he saw them. A small herd of elk in a clearing about 75 yards ahead. Maybe 80. 5 of them, including a large bull with a decent rack. They were grazing near a stand of pines, heads down, completely unaware of him. Carl's heart rate picked up. This was what he'd come for. He raised his rifle slowly, pressed the stock against his shoulder, sighted through the scope on the largest bull. The animal was broadside, a perfect shot. Carl controlled his breathing, placed the crosshairs just behind the front shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked. The sound of the shot cracked through the silence like breaking glass. And then Carl watched something impossible happen. The bullet left the barrel. He saw it. Actually saw it as it moved through the air. Slow. Impossibly slow. The round traveled maybe 50 feet, tumbling slightly, and then it just stopped. Just stopped. Hung there in the air for a moment, wobbling slightly like a coin spinning on a table, and then dropped straight down to the ground with a soft metallic clink. Carl lowered his rifle. His hands were shaking. His mouth was dry. He stared at the spot where the bullet had fallen, trying to make sense of what he'd just seen, but his brain couldn't process it. Bullets don't stop in midair. Bullets don't fall to the ground unfired. He walked forward slowly, eyes locked on the spot, and when he reached it, he knelt down and picked up the bullet. The lead was still warm. He turned it over in his fingers. Completely intact, unfired, pristine. The brass casing was still attached, as if it had never been shot at all, as if the powder inside had never ignited. Carl's hands were trembling now. He looked up at the clearing. The elk were gone. All 5 of them. Vanished. The clearing was empty. No tracks in the snow. No sound of hooves or breaking branches. Just gone. The forest held its breath. Carl stood there, bullet in one hand, rifle in the other, and felt the world tilting beneath him. Felt reality becoming soft and unreliable. And then, behind him, something spoke. Hello. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, about 20 feet away. Carl hadn't heard it approach, hadn't sensed movement or footsteps. It was simply there, as if it had materialized from the air itself, pulled from the shadows between the trees. It was humanoid, roughly 6 feet tall, maybe slightly taller, but wrong in ways that made Carl's brain struggle to process what he was seeing, like trying to solve an equation with missing numbers. The proportions were off. The arms too long, hanging past where the knees should be. The torso too narrow, compressed. The legs seemed jointless, moving with a fluidity that human legs don't possess. It stood too still, perfectly motionless in a way that living things are never motionless. No swaying, no shifting of weight, no breathing that Carl could detect. The skin wasn't skin exactly, more like a tight, seamless covering, dark and textured in a way that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Matte black, but not quite black. Some color adjacent to black that Carl's eyes couldn't quite register. The surface of it seemed to shift slightly when he looked directly at it, as if his vision couldn't quite focus. The face was the worst part. Flat, angular, featureless except for too dark. Recessed eyes that didn't blink and a mouth that was just a thin line across the lower portion of the face. The eyes were large, too large, and set too far apart. They reflected nothing. No light, no emotion. Just dark pits that seemed to go back forever. It wore something that might have been a uniform, or might have been part of its body. A black, form-fitting suit with no visible seams or fasteners or pockets. On its head, a strange helmet or crown, metallic and angular, with protrusions that Carl couldn't make sense of. They curved back and away from the skull in ways that seemed decorative and functional at the same time. In its hand, or what passed for a hand, something with too many joints and fingers that were too long, it held a small cube, black, smooth, about the size of a cigarette pack. The cube pulsed with a faint internal light, blue-white and cold. "Hello," the being said again. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, not from its mouth, which didn't move, from inside Carl's head, somehow. Inside his skull, calm, flat, emotionless, like a recording of a voice rather than a voice itself, like someone speaking through a layer of static. Carl tried to speak. His mouth wouldn't work. His throat had closed. His tongue felt thick and useless. "I am Ausso One," the being said. Each word arrived in Carl's mind with perfect clarity, but no warmth, no inflection. "You will come with me." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a command. It was just information, a statement of fact about what was going to happen next. Carl felt his body moving before he consciously decided to move. Not paralyzed exactly, not controlled by strings or force, but compelled, as if the air itself was gently pushing him forward, as if gravity had shifted and forward was the only direction that made sense anymore. He walked toward the being, rifle still in his hand, bullet still clutched in his other palm, and realized with a distant, dreamlike horror that he couldn't stop himself. His legs moved. His feet carried him across the frozen ground. His body obeyed something that wasn't his will. Ausso One raised the cube. The light inside it intensified, pulsing faster, and Carl felt something shift in his perception. The forest around him became distant, translucent, like he was looking at it through frosted glass. The cold air vanished. Sound became muffled and strange, like being underwater. The trees seemed to fade, their outlines blurring and losing substance. "Do not be afraid," Ausso One said, though its voice carried no reassurance, no warmth, no attempt at comfort, just information, an instruction manual for what was happening to Carl's body and mind. Carl wanted to scream. He wanted to run. He wanted to raise his rifle and fire, empty every round into that thing's featureless face. But his body was no longer his own. His arms hung at his sides. His voice was gone. His thoughts were becoming slow and distant, like he was thinking through layers of cotton. The world began to dissolve, the trees fading to nothing, the ground beneath his feet becoming soft and uncertain, the sky above him fracturing into geometric shapes that hurt to look at. The last thing he remembered before everything went white was the being's eyes, dark, empty, watching him with an expression that might have been curiosity, or hunger, or clinical detachment, or nothing at all. Watching him the way you'd watch an insect under glass. Carl became aware of himself slowly, like surfacing from deep water, rising through layers of darkness and confusion until he broke through into something that approximated consciousness. He was standing, or floating, or something in between. It was hard to tell. His sense of up and down had become unreliable. The space around him was vast and cramped at the same time, defying every spatial relationship his brain tried to impose on it. It was a room, maybe, or a corridor, or both, or neither. The geometry refused to cooperate with his understanding. Walls that curved in impossible directions, meeting at angles that shouldn't exist. Surfaces that seemed to fold back on themselves, creating spaces within spaces, dimensions stacked like cards in a deck. When Carl tried to focus on where one wall ended and another began, his vision blurred and his head throbbed. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, cold and even casting no shadows. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, or from the air, or from some source beyond Carl's ability to perceive. It was too bright and too dim at the same time, washing everything in a flat, colorless illumination that made depth perception impossible. The air felt thick, pressurized, like being underwater without the water. Each breath took effort. The air tasted of metal and electricity and something else, something organic and wrong that made Carl's stomach turn. Gravity was a suggestion rather than a law. Carl's feet touched the floor. He could feel contact, pressure, but he felt weightless. When he tried to move, his body responded sluggishly, as if moving through something viscous and invisible. His limbs were heavy and light at the same time. He was still holding his rifle. That surprised him. He looked down at it, at his hands gripping the stock and barrel, and it seemed absurd. Primitive tool, wood and metal, completely inadequate for whatever situation he'd found himself in. There were others in the craft, not Ausso One, different beings, taller, thinner, translucent in a way that made Carl question whether they were physical at all. Their bodies seemed to phase in and out of solid visibility, like images on a broken television screen. They moved through the walls like ghosts, their forms flickering, leaving trails of light that faded slowly. Carl tried to count them. 3, 5, the number kept changing. They glided past him without acknowledgement, without even seeming to notice he was there. Their movements were fluid and wrong, bending in ways that joints shouldn't bend, limbs extending and contracting like they were made of something other than bone and muscle. One of them approached him, taller than Ausso One. Its body was skeletal, wrapped in that same light-absorbing material, but translucent enough that Carl could see shapes moving inside it. Organs, maybe, or machinery, or something between the two. It reached toward him with fingers that were too long, too numerous, touched his forehead. The sensation was electric, invasive, like fingers inside his skull rearranging his thoughts. Carl tried to pull away, but couldn't move. His body was frozen. He felt his memories being examined, pulled out and turned over and studied like specimens under a microscope. Childhood, first day of school, his wedding day, the birth of his children, his father's funeral. Random moments, significant and insignificant, all jumbled together and exposed. He felt naked, violated. His entire life laid bare for these things to examine and judge. Time became meaningless. Seconds stretched into hours or collapsed into nothing. Carl's watch had stopped, though he didn't notice when. The light in the craft never changed. No day or night. No way to measure the passage of time except by the accumulation of experiences that might have happened over minutes or days or weeks. Carl remembered being moved to different areas of the craft. Rooms that shouldn't exist. Spaces that folded back on themselves. A chamber with walls that seemed infinitely distant and inches away at the same time. Another room filled with structures that might have been equipment or furniture or art. Impossible to tell. They hummed with frequencies Carl could feel in his bones. In his teeth, vibrations that made his vision swim. He saw machines made of light and shadow, devices that existed only partially in three-dimensional space. Structures that hurt to look at directly, their edges blurring into dimensions his eyes couldn't process. Everything glowed with that cold, blue-white light that seemed to come from within rather than being cast upon. At some point, he saw others. Humans? Maybe. Figures in the distance, indistinct, moving slowly as if drugged or asleep or dead. They were too far away to see clearly, their features blurred and indefinite. Carl tried to call out to them, tried to shout, but his voice wouldn't work. His throat was frozen. No sound emerged. The figures didn't seem to see him. They moved past like sleepwalkers, their eyes unfocused and empty. One of them, a woman, Carl thought, though he couldn't be sure, turned her head in his direction. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. Then she was gone, phased out of existence or led away or simply erased from Carl's perception. The craft was moving. Carl knew that somehow, felt it in the pit of his stomach, in the base of his skull. Not through space exactly, through something adjacent to space, something parallel. The sensation was nauseating, vertiginous, like falling in every direction at once while remaining perfectly still. He felt himself being pulled apart at the molecular level, his atoms separating and drifting and then snapping back together. He felt his consciousness expand and contract, stretching across vast distances and then compressing into a single point. He felt time moving backward and forward and sideways all at once. And through it all, Ausso One watched him, silent, evaluating, his dark eyes reflecting nothing, judging him according to criteria Carl couldn't understand, couldn't even begin to imagine, testing him, measuring him, finding him wanting. Ausso One stood before him in a chamber Carl didn't remember entering. The being was alone now. The others had vanished or perhaps had never been there at all. Perhaps Carl had imagined them. Perhaps nothing he was experiencing was real. Perhaps he was still in the forest, lying in the snow with a bullet in his brain, hallucinating his final moments, but the fear felt real. The cold metal taste in his mouth felt real. The weight of judgment pressing down on him felt unbearably, horrifyingly real. The craft was silent except for a low, thrumming vibration that Carl could feel in his teeth, in the bones of his skull. The light had dimmed slightly, or maybe his eyes had adjusted. Ausso One stood perfectly still, watching him with those empty eyes. "You are not suitable," Ausso One said. The words hung in the air like a verdict, like a death sentence, like the end of something Carl hadn't known had begun. Carl's mind, sluggish and confused, struggled to understand. Not suitable? For what? What did that mean? Why had they taken him at all if he wasn't suitable? What had they been looking for? "We have examined you," the being continued, its voice as flat and emotionless as before, each word delivered with the same neutral precision. "Your biology is incompatible. Your consciousness lacks the required structure. Your genetic material contains insufficient complexity. You would not be useful to us." Useful. The word echoed in Carl's head, bouncing around his skull like a stone in an empty room. They'd taken him, studied him, pulled apart his thoughts and memories in physical form, examined every cell and synapse and molecule, and decided he was useless, not chosen, not special, just randomly selected from a pool of specimens, tested against unknown criteria, and discarded when he failed to meet specifications. "What do you want?" Carl managed to whisper, his voice hoarse and broken, barely audible even to himself. Ausso One didn't answer, or perhaps the answer was beyond Carl's ability to comprehend. Perhaps there was no answer that could be translated into human language, into human concepts. The being simply watched him with those dark, empty eyes, and Carl felt the weight of something vast and indifferent pressing down on him. He wasn't a person to them. He was data, a failed experiment, a specimen that didn't meet quality control standards. Carl thought of cattle, of the way ranchers select breeding stock, examining animals for size and health and genetic traits, keeping the ones that meet specifications and selling off the rest. He thought of laboratory mice bred for specific traits, culled when they developed the wrong mutations. That's what he was to them. Livestock, a mouse, a thing to be evaluated and categorized and discarded. "What were you looking for?" Carl asked, his voice stronger now, desperate. "What makes someone suitable?" Ausso One tilted its head slightly, the first movement Carl had seen it make beyond walking and reaching. The gesture might have been curiosity, or confusion, or mockery, impossible to tell. "You cannot comprehend the criteria," it said. "Your species lacks the cognitive framework, the necessary neural structures. You are incomplete." Incomplete. Another word that cut deeper than Carl expected. He wanted to argue, to protest, to demand answers. But what could he say? How do you argue with something that sees you as inherently, fundamentally deficient? How do you defend your worth to something that measures value in terms you can't understand? "You will return," Ausso One said. Not a question, not a suggestion, just information. A statement of what would happen next. And then Carl understood, in a moment of crystalline horror that cut through the fog in his mind, what had really happened. They hadn't come for him specifically. They hadn't targeted Carl Higdon, oil driller from Rawlins, Wyoming. They'd come for someone, anyone, a random selection pulled from billions of possibilities. He'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, standing in that clearing at that exact moment when they arrived. Like winning a lottery he never bought a ticket for, like being struck by lightning. Pure chance. And he'd failed. Failed a test he didn't know he was taking. Failed criteria he couldn't understand. Failed to be whatever they were looking for. Failed to possess whatever quality or trait or genetic marker made a human being suitable for their purposes. The being raised the cube again. The light inside pulsed, faster and brighter. Carl felt the world beginning to dissolve around him, the craft fading into transparency. The walls became translucent, revealing a darkness beyond that stretched forever in all directions. The floor beneath his feet became soft and uncertain. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions. What are you? Where are you from? Where is this place? What did you do to me? What were you looking for? What happens to the ones who pass your test? Where do you take them? What do you do with them? But his voice was gone, and Ausso One was already turning away, dismissing him with the casual indifference of someone discarding a broken tool. A machine that doesn't work. A specimen that failed inspection. The last thing Carl heard before reality returned, before the craft and the beings and the impossible geometry all dissolved into nothing, was a single phrase. Not spoken by Ausso One, but by something else. Something vast and distant. Something that might have been the craft itself, or the intelligence that controlled it, or the collective consciousness of whatever species had built it. A single word that contained more meaning than Carl could process. That carried within it the weight of his inadequacy, his failure, his fundamental insufficiency as a specimen of his species. Insufficient. Carl Higdon woke up face down in the snow. It was dark, fully dark. Stars overhead, bright and cold and distant. The temperature had dropped, and his body ached with the deep cold that comes from lying motionless for too long. His rifle lay beside him in the snow, exactly where it had fallen, still loaded. The bullet he'd picked up, the impossible bullet that had stopped in midair, was gone. His hands were empty. He tried to sit up. His muscles wouldn't cooperate. He felt weak, drained, like he'd been sick for days. His head throbbed. His mouth was dry, tasting of metal and something else, something organic and wrong that made his stomach churn. When he finally managed to stand, his legs buckled. He caught himself against a tree, bark rough against his palm, and waited for the dizziness to pass. His watch had stopped. When he checked it later, investigators would note that it had stopped at exactly 4:20 p.m., 2.5 hours after he'd fired that bullet into the clearing. But Carl's sense of time told him something different. Felt like days had passed. Weeks, maybe. His body felt like it had been through something profound, something traumatic. His joints ached. His muscles were sore in strange places. Deep tissue pain that suggested stress or strain he couldn't remember experiencing. He made it to his truck somehow, stumbling through the dark forest, falling twice, getting up, moving forward through pure instinct. He didn't remember the walk, didn't remember finding the logging road or locating his vehicle. One moment he was standing in the clearing, and the next he was behind the wheel, key in the ignition, engine turning over. He drove himself home. How he managed that, he never knew. The roads were empty. The night was black beyond his headlights. He drove slowly, carefully, both hands on the wheel, fighting to stay conscious. His wife was on the porch when he pulled into the driveway. Later, she'd tell investigators that she'd been waiting for hours, growing increasingly worried. She'd been about to call the police when his truck appeared. She took one look at his face and called an ambulance. At Carbon County Memorial Hospital, doctors found anomalies they couldn't explain. Carl's blood pressure was dangerously elevated, 180/110, stroke territory. He was severely dehydrated despite having drunk from his thermos that morning. His electrolytes were wrong, his sodium too low, potassium too high. His body temperature was 96.8 degrees, 2 degrees lower than normal, and on his forehead, just above his right eye, was a small puncture mark, perfectly circular, recent, surrounded by a faint bruise. It looked like something had been inserted through the skin and into the skull beneath. The doctors ran tests, blood work, x-rays, CT scan. Everything came back normal except for the things that weren't. The elevated blood pressure, the dehydration, the temperature, the puncture wound that shouldn't be there. When Carl finally told the story, haltingly, through tears, to his wife first and then to the deputy sheriff who came to take his statement, no one laughed. Something in his voice made mockery impossible. This wasn't a man seeking attention. This wasn't someone trying to get famous or sell a story to a tabloid. This was a man who'd been broken by something he couldn't understand, something that had violated him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The investigation began slowly, skeptically, but gained momentum as evidence accumulated. Sheriff's deputies returned to the clearing where Carl had been hunting. They found the elk, all 5 of them, dead, arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the clearing, heads facing inward like petals on a flower. No signs of violence or predation, no bullet wounds, no blood. They'd simply stopped living. The bodies were fresh, hadn't been scavenged, eyes still bright, no rigor mortis yet, as if they'd died moments before the deputies arrived. Though Carl said he'd seen them that afternoon, more than 12 hours earlier, they found Carl's bullet, exactly where he said it would be, lying in the snow about 50 feet from where he'd been standing when he fired. The deputies bagged it as evidence, sent it to the state crime lab. Tests confirmed what Carl had said. The round was completely intact, unfired. The powder inside the casing had never been ignited. The primer hadn't been struck. Somehow, the bullet had exited the rifle barrel without being fired. Ballistics experts had no explanation. The physical evidence was impossible, but it was there, undeniable, sitting in an evidence bag with a chain of custody and photographs and lab reports. Searchers scoured the area for evidence of the craft Carl described. 3 days of searching, dozens of volunteers, dogs and helicopters and grid patterns walked by teams of deputies and forest rangers. They found ground depressions in a field about a quarter mile from where Carl had been. 3 of them arranged in a triangle, each about 4 feet in diameter. The grass inside the depressions was dead, blackened, frost-burned despite the season. Radiation readings in the area were slightly above normal background levels. Not dangerous, but measurable. Unexplained. They found broken branches in the trees surrounding the depressions. High up, 20 or 30 feet, branches snapped cleanly as if something large had descended from above and pushed through the canopy. A witness came forward. Another hunter who'd been in the area that day, several miles from Carl's position. Name was Frank. He reported seeing a large, metallic object hovering above the tree line around mid-afternoon. He'd watched it for several minutes through his rifle scope before it vanished, just blinked out of existence like someone switching off a light. Frank had assumed it was a military aircraft. The Air Force had ranges in Wyoming, conducted training exercises. He hadn't thought much of it until he heard about Carl's story. Then he came forward, Reluctantly, knowing how it would sound, Carl underwent hypnotic regression at the suggestion of investigators. A psychologist from the University of Wyoming, Dr. Leo Sprinkle, guided him back through the experience. Under hypnosis, Carl remembered more. Details he'd suppressed or couldn't access consciously. The faces of the other beings, tall, translucent, moving through walls. The sensation of being probed, examined, taken apart and put back together. The cold, clinical efficiency of the examination. The sense that he was being judged and found wanting. And Ausso One's words, repeated over and over, "You are not suitable. Your consciousness lacks the required structure. You would not be useful to us." Carl woke from the hypnosis session in tears. The psychologist's notes record that Carl seemed traumatized not by what had been done to him, but by what it meant, by the implications of his rejection. "They didn't want me," Carl said, his voice breaking. "I wasn't good enough. What does that mean? What's wrong with me?" The psychologist had no answer. Carl never fully recovered. Not really. He returned to work eventually, went back to the oil rigs, tried to resume his normal life. But something in him had changed, broken, fundamentally altered. He was quieter, more distant. His wife said he'd wake up screaming some nights, convinced they were coming back. Other nights he'd stand at the window for hours, staring up at the stars, searching for something he couldn't name. His children noticed that he didn't like to be touched anymore. Hugs made him flinch. He'd pull away from physical contact as if it hurt, as if the memory of those beings touching him, examining him, violating his thoughts and body, had made all touch feel threatening. He gave a few interviews over the years, told his story to researchers and journalists and anyone who asked sincerely. He never changed the details, never embellished, never tried to profit from it. He just wanted people to know what had happened, wanted someone to believe him. Most did. Everyone who met him, who looked into his eyes and heard the pain in his voice, believed him. Whatever he'd experienced, it was real. It had broken something fundamental in him. You could see it, feel it. Carl Higdon died in 2013. Heart attack. He was 80 years old. He took whatever final truths he possessed, whatever details he couldn't or wouldn't share, with him into the ground. But the question remained. 50 years have passed since Carl Higdon walked into the medicine-bound national forest and encountered something that should not exist. Half a century of investigators, researchers, journalists, and skeptics have pulled his story apart, examining every detail, every inconsistency, every strange physical clue left behind. They analyzed the bullet, the elk, the impact marks in the soil, the radiation readings, the medical reports documenting Higdon's bizarre physical condition when he arrived at the hospital. And after all that time, after all that scrutiny, the case remains exactly where it began. Unsolved, unexplained, impossible, yet stubbornly refusing to disappear. Carl Higdon never changed his story. Not once. Not for the press, not for investigators, not for anyone. He described the same strange being, the same silent craft, the same impossible journey, right up until the day he died. So we're left with a question. One that sits in the air like that suspended bullet he carried home. If Carl Higdon was lying, then why does the evidence say otherwise? And if he wasn't lying, then why did they let him go? That answer, whatever it is, remains somewhere out there, buried in a Wyoming forest, drifting in the cold vacuum between stars, or locked behind doors we are never meant to open. But one thing is certain. This isn't the last time humanity will meet whatever Carl Higdon saw in those trees. And when the next encounter happens, we may not be the ones who get to walk away. If you want more stories like this, cases that challenge the official explanations and keep you looking over your shoulder, make sure you subscribe. There's a lot more waiting in the dark.